Well, good evening, everyone. My name's Karteek, and I feel like I've just jumped into the middle of the English Channel in the winter because I had this whole talk planned for you with slides and all sorts of interesting comments and jokes and everything. But all the technology fell apart about half an hour ago. And I've been practicing with it all week. I think even the banner may even now be the wrong way around. So you're going to have to take me as I am. And I'm going to talk to you basically about ultras and meditation for the next 20 minutes. And then I shall look forward to your questions. So big change of plan, but hopefully this will be of interest. And I do apologize if the banner is now the wrong way around. In the other software, everything's working perfectly. So my word of advice to you, don't use OBS unless you really know what you're doing. Okay, first of all, I'd like to thank Ron and Bakam for organizing these talks. And I was very excited to do something on ultras and meditation. I've been studying meditation myself on a practical level with the teacher Sri Chinmoy, the Indian teacher Sri Chinmoy, for almost 30 years now. And I've been dabbling in ultra events for probably about over 20 years now. So when I saw that title, I was quite excited, and in fact I got reams of material on it, and then it was quite a puzzle how I was going to actually put a talk together because I just had so much stuff. And I think those things in themselves are very hard to define. Meditation famously is very difficult to pin down. It's something extremely vast, and ultras, for anyone who's taken part in them or competed in them, are also very difficult to define. So suddenly I found myself with a huge excess of information, and I decided what I'd do is briefly talk to you about my channel swimming, and then just briefly mention the running I've done, which has mainly taken the form of a 10-day race over the last 6 or 7 years. And then I wanted to talk to you about a sort of simple definition, if you like, of meditation, and then just see how those things can link together. And I thought the best way of doing that would just be to choose 2 areas where I felt it's been of help to me. So here we go. And now you'd see all sorts of interesting slides of the channel, but my situation with the channel, I got very interested in swimming. Way back about 1994, I got obsessed with the idea of swimming the channel. I decided that I was going to do that before I would do anything else in life. I wouldn't even speak to anyone. I was going to go and swim the channel. And I went off to Dover. And after about 3 weeks of training, I decided to give the channel a go. And of course, the authorities there and the people who monitor said, well, you need a couple of years really to get used to this. But I persuaded them that I could do it. And I had to go at the channel. I got about halfway across, and of course, I didn't make it that time. I trained for about another 3 years, and then finally I got over to the other side. And like all these things, I decided, well, that's something I'll never do again in my life. It was enough for once. It was fascinating. It was very, very difficult. About 3 years later, I did it for the second time. And then I basically kept on going for about another 10 years until now I have 11 crossings. So, well, I'd love to talk to you more about the channel, but this is a very short talk. And I was going to whip through some slides so you'd see all the different angles of it. You'll just have to imagine them. And you'll just have to believe that this would have been a very interesting talk if the technology had been right. Okay, so the channel was a major influence for me until about 10 years or so ago when I got a bit more interested in ultra running. I've done marathons and things in the past, but I got involved in a race that takes place in New York every year called the 10-day race. It's actually a 10 and 6-day race that's run concurrently. And it takes place in New York, in Queens, in Flushing Meadow Park. And it's basically a race of 10 days where you basically sleep in a park, you go and pitch your tent, or they build a kind of village of marquees and tents where you can stay. And this little park is transformed into a running event where about 80 people take part. And you basically just try and see how far you can go in the course of 10 days. And you can manage your time, you can stop and sleep and eat. And of course, it all sounds quite rosy, and you start off and the first day, everything goes quite well, but then you've got to keep this thing going for what seems like an eternity. My best so far has been 500 miles. I've done that a couple of times now. And it's considered quite good, but it's sort of middle of the road. And the people who do very well in these things would be doing 600 miles. That's the sort of gold standard, or even perhaps more. So that's where I've been with running recently, and I've done that. Would have been this year would have been the seventh one of those, but unfortunately it was cancelled. So I'd have to say that I've only managed to do these things through the study of meditation with Sri Chinmoy. I don't think I'd have even found myself on the starting line or on the beach in Dover if it hadn't been for the practice of meditation. So one very interesting book, which in fact I do have here. I was going to show you slides and things, but I do have this book in front of me. Sport and Meditation is full of interesting quotes and references to the kinds of things I'm talking about. The preface is written by a Swiss triathlete champion called Olivier Bernhard, and I was going to quote from the front, and this is something I can still do. So you see, you should rely on old techniques and not modern technology. So Olivier Bernhard, who, as I said, was a triathlon champion and a duathlon champion, says, "For me, sport is meditation. By becoming conscious of this inner dimension and by training it, I overcame obstacles that I could not have overcome if I had trained the body only." And he goes on to say, "To become a complete athlete, you have to train your inner capacities with the same intensity and at the same time as you train your body." So he's talking about inner capacities there and saying that we need to be training these as much as we're training physically, if not something more. So that really takes us into the whole world of meditation and what it is. Now, I'm sure many of you listening will either study meditation or have be aware of it or have looked into it. So it's nothing new in that sense. For me, meditation begins with vastness. And here you have to imagine the wonderful presentation with pictures of mountains and sea and quotations. But it begins with vastness and this idea of yearning or entering into something that's beyond yourself. So almost all kinds of meditation are based on the idea of stilling the restless, anxious mind that's always going full speed and trying to enter into this deeper, more peaceful part of ourselves, which in my kind of meditation we call the heart center. And as I said, that's very common to all sorts of styles of meditation. It's about this stilling of the restless mind and trying to enter that deeper sense of peace and energy that we all have deep within us. And the point about the mind is it tends to be, it's very analytical, it depends on categorizing things, dividing things, splitting things up and analyzing them in that sense. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's a very powerful way of seeing reality. And in fact, it's led to huge advances in civilization. The heart, on the other hand, is associated more with this idea of expansion and unity, harmony, empathy, becoming one with things and our surroundings. So this idea of vastness, I think it starts with, for example, looking at a beautiful stretch of water or something of interest like the channel and just suddenly getting that urge that you want to enter into it, you want to somehow take part in it and almost possess it in a way. You want to become it. So it's about opening up that aspect of ourselves. I think it's something that many people experience on some level, and certainly many of you who've run or taken part in ultras, even if you don't study meditation, will say that you get those feelings, those kind of expansive feelings where you're entering into something deeper, something wider. So that leads me on to the next area, which is how I've managed to use that in doing these events. And the first thing I've noticed right from early on is that as soon as I would, and this is what I'd recommend people do, in fact, is to choose an event or sign up for something. And it could be something that's really quite out of your normal comfort zone. It seems impossible to you or absurd, but you somehow get a thrill from it. You get some kind of idea that you'd like to find out more about that thing. And that's where I would tend to just say, right, I'll sign up for that thing. I'm going to do it. And particularly if it's not something where you have to pay money up front or something, you've really got nothing to lose. So, for example, with the channel or with this 10-day race, there'll come a point, typically 3 months, 5 months, 6 months, sometime before the race, when I feel like I really need to be focusing now on that event. So I've perhaps been out doing the odd swim, the odd run, as perhaps many of us do, just to keep fit and enjoy being outside. But there comes a point where I say to myself, like, I really need to get going with this thing. And then it's quite a specific time for me. A day will come where I go for a swim, let's say, or I go out for a run, and I feel like I've taken the first steps towards this event. And it's through the meditation, it's almost like there's a mind flip. Like I'm actually already somehow in that space. I've moved out of my normal day-to-day training and just going out for a run and seeing how it feels. I'm actually somehow connected with that event. So this was the first thing that I wanted to say, was that the training becomes the event. The training is the event. The way the mind would normally look at the event is that it's something coming up in the future. I'm going to sort of train, if you like, for a certain amount, as much as I can. And then this event will happen and I'll do my best. I'll go into it with the physical capacities that I have. But what I've noticed with this idea of starting the event sort of way before it happens is that the whole thing's a kind of continuum. It's a kind of long journey or meditation, if you like. It's all part of the same thing. There's no separation. There's no kind of mental separation between bits of training, little chunks, and then this event that suddenly happens at the end. And what I found that has given me is that very quickly, each day or each training session, I'll get some kinds of insights, or things will start cropping up that will be things that I need to overcome in order to complete that event. And these could be things like overcoming fear, overcoming boredom, developing patience, developing more confidence in myself. The kinds of things that in that quote I was talking about, these inner capacities. And the thing is, we don't tend to ever focus on them or train them. We tend to just do the physical thing and come to the... For me, the meditation has allowed me to slowly take on board all those little bits and pieces and kind of work on them through the months leading up to the event. So something like patience, for example, that you'd never normally consider training, actually sometimes becomes a bit of an issue during some of your training. And the meditation somehow gives you an angle on how you might go about trying to train through that, or gives you some insight in how to go about it. The other thing that I found is that often there'll be blockages and injuries. In fact, almost every single event I've done, I've had some problem with, whether it's been a knee or a shoulder problem or a foot or something, always comes up at some stage. And after a while, I just started to say to myself, this must be part of this flow, part of this continuum. It's part of the thing that I'm trying to learn. And it's something I would like to speak much more about. And perhaps when the technology is working, it might flow a bit better. But there's definitely a feeling that you can train for 2 or 3 months quite hard. And it's as if you've really got to the stage where that injury starts to become an issue. It's as if it's always been waiting there. And far from it being something you should be super anxious and super worried about, it's something that seems to, you've actually achieved, you've got to the stage where you can face this thing. And it's also going to be something that if you can resolve it somehow through your training and through your meditation particularly, it's going to give you tremendous strength and energy when you actually come to that event. I do have numerous examples of that I would like to go into, perhaps on a future talk. But in fact, quite reassuringly, time is flowing by quite fast, and I probably think that my slides talk would have gone on forever and ever. So that would be what I call the training is the event. And it's something that's really come up to me through the meditation. And again, something I'd like to talk a lot more to you about, but just to give you a bit of a flavor. The other thing that is definitely the meditation has helped is what I call dividing up the distance. So the distances that you're faced with in these events can be absolutely frightening as anything. You've got miles to do, you've got hours to run, you've got days to run, whatever the event might be. And it can actually be frightening, to say the least. For the channel, you have to go out and do a 6-hour swim in the cold sea. And in fact, you have to do numerous 6-hour swims really to get yourself ready. And the prospect of that can be just bewildering. But what I've managed to do, and in fact, I haven't really consciously done this, it's just seemed to have slotted into place over the years, but it's found a way to, I think partly through the imagination and partly just through sheer willpower, have found a way to get through some of these distances. So to give you some concrete examples, when I used to train in the pool, it was a 50-meter pool, and I would say typically start with a mile or something. And for me in those days, a mile would take me 28 minutes, and it's a 50-meter pool, so it would be 4 times a 7-minute session of, I think it's 400 meters. So each of those little chunks I knew would take me 7 minutes, and then the mile would take me 28 minutes. And if I was doing a mile and a half, it would be that plus 16 minutes, etc. And the whole thing would start to take on a shape, if you like. And I would know exactly where I was inside that mile or 2 miles, or even building up to, say, a 3-mile swim. And what I would then do is, if I wanted to do longer that, I would just go through that whole thing in my head, and then I would just double it. I would stop after the 3-mile point, and I'd just go back through that whole image. For the long swims in the sea, I started to do something similar. I just couldn't take the idea of swimming for 6 hours. So I would kind of cheat my mind slightly. I would go to the beach where it was I was training, and I would actually start my watch about even 5 minutes before I was in the water, and I wouldn't know exactly how long it had taken. And by the time I was in the water, I knew that I'd actually done about 5 or 10 minutes. It was like a cheat in a way. And then I'd have a course that I knew would take me, say, half an hour, and I'd swim down this course and back. But then sometimes I'd take a bit more time over it, or I'd stop at the end, and I'd really just be going for time. I wouldn't be worrying too much about distance. Again, this idea of trying to sort of con your mind slightly, but enough that you still get the confidence from it. So I'd have this sort of 5 or 10 minute extra in the bank, if you like. And then somehow on the first hour, I'd manage also to get another 5 or 10 minutes out of just messing around for a bit at the end of one of my loops, or just lengthening it slightly. So without even looking at my watch, by this stage, I'd know that I might have an hour and a half or something. And then I could just repeat that same process, go through exactly what I'd done, until lo and behold, somehow by magic, you can get through 3 or 4 hours. And then by that time, it's actually quite easy sometimes to complete another couple of hours. And the point with that sort of stealing from your mind, if you like, at the beginning, is very easy after you've done 5 hours and 50 minutes. Let's say, for you, just add on another 5 minutes. You're so happy that you finished this, you can just then make up what you've stolen, if you like. And it sounds like very, very tiny incremental differences, but somehow just that ability to get on top of your mind, if you like, is about not letting your mind be totally dominating and totally in control. Just through your imagination, you're able to come up with these ways of getting through things. And just lastly on that point, when I did the 10-day race, I was trying to do 50 miles a day on this race. And again, there's all sorts of things in that are easy to allow your mind to be confused, which is quite a help. But in order to do the 50 miles, I had to do a certain number of laps around what was 0.8 of a mile. And I think if I remember rightly, it was 63, either 62 or 63 laps. So some days it would be 62 and some days it would be 63 laps. And the best thing for me was just to do 21 laps in the morning, 21 in the afternoon, and 21 in the evening. And of course, all those sort of things sound easy, and then on the day, it becomes excruciatingly difficult to follow any kind of program at all. But I just wanted to point out, one of the things I did was that I'd managed the morning without too much difficulty. And then the afternoon was always reasonably okay. But what I really struggled with, and particularly mentally, was the nighttime set of 21 laps. It's about 18 miles, I think. So what I used to do in the afternoon, and I think it's partly where my mind was after a couple of days, I just said to myself, right, I'm going to start doing some of my evening laps now in the afternoon. So I would do 2 or 3 of my 21 laps set in the afternoon, and then I'd start doing what I was thinking were evening laps. Now, of course, to anyone watching, you're just still going around the same loop, the same track aimlessly, and people are counting you, and they have no idea what you're thinking. But for me, I was absolutely in that other world of running at night and getting that difficult stuff out of the way. And then once I'd done 5 or 6 laps, I knew that I only had 15 to do at night, and then I'd come back and do my afternoon ones. Now, I wanted to try and talk to you a bit more about that and explain how that worked, but just to give you a rough feel for this idea of using your imagination, and with me, the incentive has definitely come through meditation to do that, to find a way to somehow treat the distances in a different way by splitting them up, by dividing them up into all sorts of different fragments and then adding them all back together in such a way that your mind becomes really quite confused by what's going on. But, and this is the key thing, it's very happy because you've actually completed the mileage and the distance that you've planned to train by the end of it. So little tricks of the trade. As I said at the beginning, I think ultras, for me, encompass all of life. Meditation also encompasses all of life. There's just an infinite amount to talk about. And I thought I would just pick those 2 little areas where, for me, the training and the event, the distance. So it's actually now past 20 minutes, and I don't know if anyone has any questions, but if you do, you can type them into the live chat. Otherwise, I'd be more than happy to answer questions afterwards. I think this video will stay up, and please feel free to ask questions, and I can write back to this. I think it may take a day or 2 to edit this. So gone by very quickly. Sincere apologies that I couldn't do the original talk. Perhaps it's given you some feel for something to do with meditation and ultras. If I'm invited back, I will do my original talk, and it would be great to see you all again and chat further. So it may be that, again, with technology, I'm afraid for some reason questions aren't coming up, but I'm seeing something now. Okay, so Devashishi Tobi is saying, what meditation techniques particularly helped you with the channel crossing? So it's curious because I think it's almost like sometimes later on, after you've managed to complete these events, it's not as if I sit there and meditate and I suddenly get this. I mean, it does happen that you meditate and you get this tremendous energy and you just want to go and burn it off and train. But I think over the course of a year or the training, it's not as if you're particularly aware day by day of something happening. But somehow when you do the event, you realize that just incrementally, just by doing this thing day by day, and it's not as if every day you're going to get these fantastic insights and great meditations, but if you're able just to discipline yourself enough to meditate for 5, 10, 15 minutes every day, by the time you do one of these events, something seems to click into place and your mind just has that slight advantage, or some part of you has just a little bit more control over the mind that comes in. And with a swim, usually within an hour, I mean, I've trained for this swim for, it's years sometimes that you've done this, and you're all ready and you're enthusiastic, and then literally within an hour or so you can be the only thing you want to do is get out of the water, no matter who you've got to come and help you, how much you've paid for this thing, how much you've trained. All you want to do is just be warm and just forget this whole thing. But somehow through that day by day training, the mind, or the sort of more sensible part of your mind, let's say, just says, okay, let's just hold on here a second, let's give this another half hour, let's give it another hour. And slowly, again, along the lines of those kinds of techniques of just giving yourself the space to let something happen and being patient, developing those ideas of patience and working on your own self-confidence, etc. Somehow you can get through those tough patches. And often within an hour or two, you'll find you're quite happy again and you're swimming along and you're actually enjoying the event. And many times in these events, they can be very, very enjoyable. And it's almost like you'll just go through these very tough patches. And for me, it's almost like a fever. It's like when you have a fever and it's very intense for maybe half an hour or perhaps 45 minutes. And if you can just get through those moments, suddenly everything becomes easier again. And particularly on those long training swims, if I could get through the first 2 hours, somehow the mind, something would just lift, and suddenly all the anxiety and the depression and the fear would just somehow evaporate. And I know that it's from having put the time in to do the meditation each day. And no matter how things are going, if you can just keep that little space, 5, 10, 15 minutes a day, it's remarkable how that will help you. A few other questions here. How do you solve the injuries during the race? Okay, so that's something I'm absolutely fascinated by. And I've been, as I said, every single event I've done, I've had some kind of injury. And it's led me to believe that it's almost, again, this idea of the training and the event being the same thing. It's part of the same process. It's something that is going on that we're having to learn about. And in fact, I'd say even to the extent that the whole point of the event sometimes, in retrospect, has been to try and solve what that injury somehow represents to you. So it can be quite paradoxical that this block or this injury comes along, and it's often the very thing that you need to be able to do, which is, for example, swimming, you need to be able to move your shoulder, or in running, you need to be able to place your foot down. And the injury comes and it stops you doing that very thing. And you wonder, apart from the fact that you've been doing that repeatedly, which might be something to do with why it's come up, but for some reason, it seems to draw your mind, draw your attention to that thing and make you deal with it. And all sorts of things, I think, happen. It seems to open up other avenues, other energies that enable you then to complete the race. I think also sometimes the reason we do these things is because there's all sorts of deep-seated things we're trying to solve, and the training just brings them to the fore, brings them to the light, which I think it's very important not to get too concerned with them, because it's a positive step you've taken. When you get to that stage where things are blocking you and you're injured, you've actually got to that stage, you've made the effort, and that's what's happened to you. And I don't think it's some kind of random punishment, if you like, or something that's randomly come in and stopped you. So I think it's all quite significant. Something I've been collecting notes on, and I'd like to talk for hours, and when the technology is working, we'll get that going. I think I have time for one more question. As I said, I'll make a note of these questions and I will write some answers after the video. So just trying to read down here. I'm seeing some names of people I know, and I'm quite embarrassed they've come on and seen that I completely messed up. Though someone does say very inspiring, they're very encouraging. That's actually one of the keys of meditation. Okay, so I've done injuries. What was my best 10-day race experience? Someone said. Okay, so many experiences on the 10-day race. I think, again, coming back to the injuries thing, was one time when I had a very bad knee problem about 2 months before the race. And it got to the stage where there was just no way I was going to be able to do this race. But something deep inside me, and again, I think this comes back to the meditation, where something is stronger than what's happening to you physically, even if it's something that was pretty significant. It was a knee injury. I could hardly walk on it for about 3 weeks. But I was so obsessed with wanting to do this race that I just said, right, I went all the way to New York with all my luggage and all my gear. So I'm going to go there and just see what happens. And it got to 3 days before the race, still knee problem. I could just about run on it, but not far. And I still just thought, right, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start this race. And I did. And for the first 2 or 3 days, it was quite swollen and it was quite painful, but it wasn't so painful that I couldn't move on it. And then by about the 4th day, it disappeared, pretty much disappeared. But all that time, it had forced me into moving in a different way. It kind of completely changed my gait in a way that I think, stop me getting future injuries and enable me to finish the race quite well. And it was one of the first things that started me thinking about injuries. And I don't mean to say that all injuries are things you remember any of them now, because I didn't plan that in my talk, but that's something that just came into my mind. We are now at 7:30 exactly. So thanks very much for listening to me. And I do hope we can do this again. And I shall now say goodbye. And once again, thanks very much to Run and Become for organising these talks. I think there's going to be quite a few more coming up in the future. Very important, I think, in these troubling times. And they always manage to keep us running. So thank you very much and good night.